Welcome to Mountain Strong. Today we are at Ruth Arcand Park. Ruth Arcand Park is a small park in the suburbs here in Anchorage. It actually is a park that is another example of where people here in Anchorage just love nature. And even though we're surrounded by wilderness, there was this block of land that developers had interest into turning into basically another subdivision or something or whatever. But anyway, a group of concerned citizens led by someone named Ruth Arcand got together and decided to get the funds together to get this land set aside for public use. And so it's been that ever since. There's a network of trails here. During the wintertime, I think it's used for like cross-country skiing, but also during the summertime, used for walking. I guess I don't know how many people do this when there's so many other more appealing trails about the place, but also it's sort of an equestrian center. And I was actually surprised to learn that, yeah, people own horses up here in Alaska. Anyway, today we're having a look together at Psalm 99. Psalm 99, let's go ahead and read that now. The Lord reigns, let the peoples tremble. He sits enthroned upon the cherubim, let the earth quake. The Lord is great in Zion. He is exalted over all the peoples. Let them praise your great and awesome name. Holy is He. The King in His might loves justice. You have established equity. You have executed justice and righteousness in Jacob. Exalt the Lord our God. Worship at His footstool. Holy is He. Moses and Aaron were among His priests. Samuel also was among those who called upon His name. They called to the Lord, and He answered them. In the pillar of the cloud He spoke to them. They kept His testimonies and the statute that He gave them. O Lord our God, You answered them. You were a forgiving God to them, but an avenger of their wrongs. Exalt the Lord our God, and worship at His holy mountain, for the Lord our God is holy. As you begin to reflect upon the words of this psalm with me, I want you to remember a time in history when God's people were under the rule of a nation known as Persia. For those of you who know biblical history, you know that God's people were carried into captivity by the Babylonians. At least the southern kingdom was, the northern kingdom having already been carried away by the Assyrian kingdom. But anyway, God's people had been carried away into captivity. And then the Medo-Persian Empire. Sometimes we just refer to them as the Persian Empire, but they were a coalition between the Medes and the Persians. But anyway, geek point. But the Persians came and they defeated the Babylonians, and they allowed the Jews to go back to their homeland. Well, not all the Jews did. A lot of the Jews remained in captivity, and that kind of spawned the fact that in the New Testament times you have synagogues. Well, anyway, let me get to the point. So during the Persian Empire, God's people were being controlled. Some of them were living in captivity still by choice. In that context, you have a Jewish person becoming queen of the Persian Empire. And so Ahasuerus, the Persian king at that time, marries a woman named Esther. Some of you might remember that account of biblical history. Well, anyway, the drama of the story of Esther is that the Jews are at risk of being persecuted. They are at risk of being exterminated by the Persian government. Ahasuerus has signed a law into effect. He doesn't realize all the implications of it that basically will result in the Jews being killed. Well, Esther comes to the aid of the Jews, but there is a problem that makes the story all that much more dramatic, and that is that she can't enter into the courtroom of this pagan king unannounced and uninvited. And so she doesn't know whether or not she's going to have access to the king's ear. Well, of course she does, but you can read more about that in the book of Esther. Anyway, for the purpose of our account, I want you to carry that image of how there was a Gentile king that was not easily accessed and that people were afraid to approach. They couldn't come uninvited. They couldn't come without the king's desire for them to do so. Contrast that with the image of the king that you see here in Psalm 99. Now, I'll point out, I haven't really been careful to point this out, we're at really the conclusion of a series of psalms that have dealt with God's kingship, and they've all talked about different nuances of God's kingship. But as we think about God's kingship as presented by this psalm is a psalm that invites people to serve God, like the other psalms do. And of course, in calling people to worship and serve this God, it does so on the basis of where He is. He's above the cherubim, it says in verse 1. And that could have reference to the fact that He is over the angelic hosts. Could also have reference to the fact that He's over the Ark of the Covenant. And so whichever picture he's talking about, God is in a glorious position, an exclusive position, a powerful position. He reigns specifically in Zion, but notice in verse 2 how it says that He is exalted over all the peoples. And so there's this inclusiveness about this God. And this call, therefore, out of that inclusiveness to worship. Let the peoples, let everyone praise your great and awesome name. Holy is he, holy is God. He is holy. He does right in verse 4 is a reason that he should be praised. He is beyond man in verse 5. We've already saw that in verse 1, but that's yet another reason that he should be praised and that we should come to his footstool, as it were. But when we think about the main thrust of this psalm and why we would want to serve this God, have him as our king, is because he listens and answers. And there are a couple of figures from biblical history that are brought up as examples of the fact that God listens and answers. And think about the relationship in prayer that we know Moses had, but we are seeing that also Aaron and Samuel had with God. This sort of conversive nature that they had with God. They could come to God with their concerns. There was this interplay between God and them, especially with Moses. You know how on a couple of occasions God threatened to destroy the people of Israel, and Moses served as intercessor for them. God listened to him. He heard him. He answered him. And so when we think about the kingship of God, obviously he's high and holy and exalted, and obviously he always does what's right, and for those two reasons alone, he's worthy of being worshiped and served. But as you think about the glory that is our God, and you think about how wonderful and majestic he is, think about the fact that he is a God who can be approached. And again, contrast that with the picture of Ahasuerus that we began with. But notice, in the context of how he listens and answers, we're being shown something more about God as our King. Yes, by all means, we need to worship and praise him, and certainly this is a psalm which points us to that. But we need to remember, in worshiping and praising him, that he is a God who has given his testimony and a God who has given statutes. Moses, Aaron, and Samuel respected that testimony and respected those statutes. And for that reason, they were heard and God answered them. We need to be people who do the same thing. But also, in the course of thinking about our God, it's wonderful that he will forgive, but remember what Moses, Aaron, and Samuel also remembered, that he is a God who would also avenge. We must never lose sight of that fact, that our God is an avenging God, a God whose will must be respected, because even though he is awesome and wants to be approached, he has within him that need to execute justice, to do what's right. And part of doing what's right also means judging that which is evil. The psalm concludes in verse number 9 with this sort of call to the mountain of God. And I think how appropriate from the New Testament standpoint. Isaiah chapter 2 verses 1 through 4 is a passage which people of the Lord's church from time immemorial have been applying to the Christian age. And in that passage, people are invited to come to the mountain of the house of the God of Jacob. And certainly that's where we find ourselves invited today. We want to serve God. We want to sing his praises. We love him as our King because he's so approachable. But let's always remember the fact that he is a God who's given testimony and statutes. He's a God who forgives, but he's a God who avenges. And as we serve him as our King, let's keep those things in mind, praise him all the more, and learn what his will is for us, and not take him for granted. May God bless you today.